Did you ever read those Choose Your Own Adventure books? Anybody? Golly, is this an age thing? Right over there? Okay, so I guess I'll explain this. A Choose Your Own Adventure book is a narrative, but you get to a critical juncture in the story and the fourth wall gets broken in the book and you are suddenly presented with options. How you as the reader want to proceed in the narrative. Do you fight the Minotaur or do you run away from the Minotaur? I obviously read a very specific kind of Choose Your Own Adventure books. Do you trust the mysterious stranger in the hood and follow him into the dark, or do you draw your sword and fight him? Your choices dictate how the story goes. You have to flip to the next page where it says whether you reach a happy ending or a very grisly end. Never follow a stranger in the hood is my advice if you are reading a Choose Your Own Adventure book. Indulge me this morning. I'd like to do a Choose Your Own Adventure sermon. Once upon a time, there was a famine in the land, and a starving family had to make a decision. Would they stay home and risk death, or cross a border and risk death? You have 3 choices of stories to hear. We'll go through all of them, but whose story would you like to hear? Jesus' story, Judah's story, or Eli's? You actually have to say something. Jesus? All right. For months, you've been hearing about that migrant caravan at our southern border, right? People from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. And we've heard all the stories of why they're coming, right? Violence, organized crime, systemic corruption, roots that go back to the region's Cold War conflicts and the North American interference in Central American politics. Yes, we know those. Did you also know climate change is a reason? Everything's terrible. Climate change is one of the reasons why that region is destabilizing, because there have been massive crop failures leading to famine because it doesn't rain. Jesus used to sow maize and beans on land near an ancient ruin in western Honduras. He's indigenous Maya, and Jesus abandoned his land this year after years of repeated crop failures. It didn't rain this year, he said. It didn't rain last year. My maize field didn't produce a thing, and with my expenses, everything we invested, we didn't have any earnings. There was no harvest. Should Jesus stay at home, or should he try to cross a border? You have to say something again. Cross the border. Jesus is a real person. He is a part of the migrant caravan. He is headed north, and there is good reason to believe that Jesus is there now. Here's what would happen if Jesus had stayed. Jesus, not trusting Americans to actually follow their own laws and let him apply for asylum, stays home. But climate change exacerbates the famine, and desperate for food, Jesus finally joins the Honduran cartel that has been trying to make him join for years, and Jesus dies in gang warfare like many men his age, and his wife and children end up in the caravan anyway. Eli or Judah? Judah. Judah was married, grown sons, grandchildren of his own. Famine strikes the land. It is widespread. It is so widespread it hits the full Arabian Peninsula and all the boundaries surrounding Egypt. It wasn't just a momentary famine. It was season after season, 7 years of crop failure and not enough rain, until starvation was threatening not just him but all of his brothers' families. Should he stay or go? You have to say something. Go. Judah's father, Jacob, sometimes called Israel, though old, orders Judah and his brothers to cross the border into Egypt to beg for relief. Eventually, the famine becomes so terrible, Judah will move his entire clan, all the families of the 12 brothers, into Egypt, and they survive because of the providential placement of their long-lost brother Joseph. Here's what happens if Judah stays. With no end in sight, the famine starts to eat away at the vulnerable members of the families. The young and the very old die. Judah's father Jacob dies without ever seeing Joseph again. Judah and his brothers end up in violent conflict with nearby neighbors over dwindling supplies of food. Eventually, they realize the family is too large to sustain, and they split apart to survive on their own. And there are no tribes of Israel. And Joseph and his brothers never reconcile in Egypt. And Moses is never born. Eli's story. Eli was married and had 2 children and lived in a small community just northwest of the Dead Sea in Israel. But that region of the world suffers from drought, and it was one of those seasons. Actually, it was more than just that season. It was so long-lasting that Eli and his family realized the only thing left for them at home was their own graves. Should they stay or go? Go. Eli, otherwise known as Elimelech, his wife Naomi, his 2 kids, crossed south and east across the Dead Sea until they crossed the border into what we call Jordan now, but what they called Moab. And they lived there until Eli died, and his wife Naomi had to raise their boys himself. If they had stayed, as the famine stretched on, first Naomi and then the children died of malnutrition, and Elimelech ended a beggar in the street, eventually killed trying to steal food. Consequently, King David, never born. There are 3 stories there, 1 modern and 2 from the Bible, all centered on what happens when a famine strikes the human family. It should come as no surprise to us that socioeconomic distress is what most often causes immigration. Whether the river they have to cross is the Jordan River or the Dead Sea or the Mississippi or the Rio Grande, people who are facing death will do whatever they have to do to ensure the safety, welfare, and future of their families. Life can seem like a choose-your-own-adventure story when you've got everything, but it's not. Because starving to death is not an adventure. The story of Ruth is a story of migration. Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons leave Bethlehem behind and immigrate to Jordan, to Moab, to escape a famine. And decades later, after the death of all of the men in the family, Naomi and former daughter-in-laws migrate from Moab to Bethlehem. Naomi is coming home, that's true, but she's coming back as a social zero. She has no sons, she has no husband, she has no grandsons. She has no value to her culture. She is an object of pity and derision. She is not going to be welcomed. Ruth is coming to Bethlehem as an immigrant, and as an unwanted immigrant at that. Because the people of Israel distinguished amongst them the strangers who could come and live there. For the foreigners, they used words like czar, who described the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Moabites who had no part in Israel. Do you remember where Moab comes from? Remember back Abraham, and he has a nephew, Lot, and Lot has some daughters, and Lot and his daughters end up having incestuous relationships, and they have kids. One of those kids is Moab. So there's the Ruth kind of immigrant, which is not the good one, and there are the Ger, the aliens, the sojourners, the one who come from outside the community but can have a place within the community. They're the refugees, they're the immigrants, the acceptable ones. But that was not Ruth. She was a Moabite. She was a foreigner from an enemy tribe. She was just as much of a social zero as Naomi. And their immigration story, if you've read any of the rest of the Bible, you're like, oh, this is going to end badly, because it always ends badly, doesn't it? But surprisingly, it doesn't. Maybe it's just because I spent a lot of time with it, but there are not a whole lot of stories in the Bible that I would describe to you as happy endings. The book of Ruth, though, is one of those, outsider novels because all of the main characters are remarkably good, faithful, gracious, generous. Now, don't get me wrong, Ruth starts brutally sad, right? Naomi is basically a female Job who loses everything and doubts God loves her. She says, "Call me Mara." Mara means bitter, okay? Things have gone wrong if you want to change your name to bitter. But from the moment we meet Ruth, we are treated to a story of loyalty and love and hope and blessing out of nothing. Our scripture reading this morning, Ruth 2, is just this perfect example. Now, the law of Moses had all these provisions in it to provide for certain classes of people, for the poor, for the alien, for the widow, and one of those laws was the gleaning of the fields. When people harvested the fields, they were supposed to leave a border unharvested so that the poor, alien, and widow could harvest it for themselves. And Ruth, she's a trifecta. She's all of those things. And so she shows up in Bethlehem with Naomi and immediately gleans the fields. If she doesn't, they're not going to eat. She gleans right behind the official workers and follows them. They're doing brutal work. She's doing brutal work. She's not taking breaks. But this is dangerous. She is not an acceptable foreigner. She's a Moabite. She's a woman without a man's protection. The chances that she could be used and abused by Israelites is really high, and we know that because the text tells us that Boaz is afraid it will happen. But Boaz shows up. Now, we've not met Boaz before this, but Matthew tells us that Boaz's mom was Rahab. You know, the sex worker. Boaz not only notices Ruth, he knows who she is, he knows what dangers she's in besides the law, and he is generous to her. I can only assume that Boaz's merciful provision for Ruth, providing for her protection, feeding her from his own food, telling his workers to drop some of their own harvest so she can glean it, I tend to think it's because he was raised by a formerly foreign woman who was generously included in the family of God despite the fact that she used to be a madam. He sees this immigrant woman not as a threat, but as a fellow human being, a woman of honor and dignity who is hustling to provide for a woman she could have walked away from. She knows and he knows that Ruth is deserving of generosity and care, and eventually, spoiler, Ruth will negotiate with Boaz in a fairly scandalous way and push his generosity even farther. Though she is a foreigner, though she is a childless widow, she is sunk deep into poverty, they will stretch the bonds of levirate marriage, and they will marry. And they will produce an heir for Naomi, who is, of course, grandfather of King David. The story of Christmas that we anticipate today has its roots way back into the time of Elimelech and Naomi, of famine and forced migration, and an unacceptable immigrant woman, Ruth, who wouldn't stay home or die. Maybe you're feeling all the ways the story of Ruth touches our lives and this world and this moment. It feels like a million ways this story is relevant. It's a story of the continuing instability of the world and how quickly a secure life can become a life of poverty and migration. It's the story of how the bonds of love transcend religion and nationality and how solidarity with one another leads to life and abundance for everyone. It's a story about how we expand our understanding of law and mercy and national borders to include human beings who are worthy of dignity and honor. But this morning, I'm really struck by how it's a story about how the domino of consequences fall from just one choice for mercy. In the tight window, if you're just looking at Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, it's a private story about second chances and about grace and about unexpected life. But this private story of radical generosity becomes within 2 generations a story that changes the history of Israel. That's how the Christmas story plays out too. In tight scope, it's a man and his wife and their newborn son who run to Egypt to escape political persecution, and within 2 generations, a new religion is growing and changing the face of the planet. It's the story of our present. All over the world, we believe that God's future is being built in the lives of men and women and kinfolk and children who are seeking to cross borders away from death and into life. That God's future is waiting to spill out of these small private stories that are yet untold but will be given fertile soil if only we will choose mercy. Because none of us, most of us, are Ruth. Don't you want to be Ruth? I want to be Ruth. I want to be the good guy in the story. I want it to be about me. I want it to be about contemplating loyalties and crossing borders, but that's not me. I've never had to cross a border. And if we're not Ruth, that means we approach this story, we have 2 choices. We are either Boaz, who responds to Ruth with generosity, or we are the unseen forces in the community that Boaz has to protect Ruth from. And right now, this very day, Ruth and Naomi are languishing by metal fences with numbers written on their arms facing armed guards as they are deliberately kept from the asylum process that they have a right to. In these days, where asylum seekers are bruised and abused and even found dead in the hands of our own government, we can no longer export our responsibility to fellow children of God, because 95% of that caravan on our southern border, guess what they are? They're Christians. Because of the story of Ruth, we know that individual private acts of radical generosity don't stay private. They become forces for change that change the world for the better, just as we know that individual private acts of cruelty continue the current degradation of the human family. So it's a choose your own adventure again. We can choose the posture of Boaz, or we can choose the posture of those who would threaten the immigrant amongst us, but we have to choose. Maybe this is not the choose your own adventure book that you would like, but it's the only one we have. You can either stay locked in your own world, unwilling to see the humanity and the worth and the dignity and the honor in God's desired future in the eyes and lives of the migrants on our borders, or you can go. You can go where God sends you, where sends us, to our elected officials in their offices, to our communities, to speak to our neighbors and families, to the border itself, to offer aid and care and love to those who bravely sought a better life. 30 religious leaders were arrested this last week on the border. I don't know if you know that. Probably wasn't widely reported on. Some of them disciples, some of them Presbyterians, some of them Jews, some of them Muslims, some of them atheists, arrested on the border. All they were doing was singing and praying and crying out in Spanish that the people on the other side were humans and loved. So you have to choose. The time is long past us when the choice should have been made. Will you heed the story of Ruth, the great-great-grandmother of David, the grandmother of Jesus, the border-crossing immigrant? Will you push the domino for life or for death? Will you stay or will you go?